Hi there, and welcome to the NGINX Community Chats. Today we're going to be coffee klatching a little bit on open source. From the German, coffee klatch means coffee and gossip. And because of that, I want you to understand that this is a very informal chat. During this, you'll learn about a few things that are open sourcey, meet some of the people behind open source here at NGINX and F5, and maybe even learn something new. I'm Dave McAllister, open source technologist here at NGINX, and with me today is Dan Callahan. Dan, give me some background on yourself. What do you do here?
Sure. As mentioned, my name's Dan. I joined F5, I joined NGINX really just over a year ago through an acquisition. I was at a startup that was trying to do server-side WebAssembly. We were trying to figure out like how do we take this new technology that makes it easy to sandbox third-party code and arbitrary languages, and can we use that to build plugins for SaaS applications? And then interest rates stopped being zero and funding stopped being easy to come by. And we went talking to various companies, and F5 said, hey, you know what? Our whole business is built on programmability. That sounds interesting. Why don't you come over here and see what makes sense? So I've been over here in the NGINX product group since November of last year. And my focus has mostly been on the NGINX Unit project, though I've also been put on less relevant for the open source side right now. But we just announced an AI gateway product we're working on to help larger enterprises safely consume these generative AI systems that are becoming popular. But my whole history up until this point has been open source. I spent close to 9 years at Mozilla, where I worked on the Persona browser ID authentication system, which is kind of a precursor to passkeys. Helped build the Mozilla Developer Network, MDN. If you have any front end developers listening here, is like the resource. It's the Wikipedia for the web. And just I was in the emerging technology group at Mozilla when we created WebAssembly, when we created Rust, or at least really invested in it. And I'm now over here at F5 and NGINX and starting to see some of those technologies come back around and get productized and augment other products and other companies. And that's really exciting.
Cool. Actually, the sweatshirt I'm wearing today is from the Sprint 3, NGINX Sprint 3, which is the first time that the NGINX audience in general got to hear about WebAssembly, where we identified it as one of the major technologies that you had to focus on to be able to keep your job by 2025. So glad you're here with this.
Well, I think that's, if I could stop for 1 second there, I think that's one of the really interesting things about WASM is that I think the technology itself, and it's already everywhere,
Yeah.
but you just don't know it. The impact, you look at something like Java, which reached, ubiquitous, still is in the world. But the whole slogan was write once, run anywhere. And WebAssembly is doing much the same because WebAssembly isn't language specific. If you have to know about WebAssembly, we've done something wrong. Right? Like the whole purpose of this technology is like it is a universal runtime. It's a universal binary format. It's safe, it's sandboxed. And so it should just be another compiler target. And you don't really think in the same way, like you shouldn't have to go and learn ARM assembly or Intel assembly unless you're specifically at that level.
But you have to know to target it. And
Yes.
that's one of the things that's really important. And it's actually why you saw in my space observability, open telemetry did not have the same impact that open census got with Google and on. Basically because open tracing to open telemetry, sorry.
Yeah.
Basically because no one knew it was a potential target. If you go back as far as I can go back, we used to do cross compilers for real-time machines all the time. And you had to again know where you were targeting to. WebAssembly is a universal target. I think that's the thing that everybody forgets.
Yeah.
So
And here in NGINX, one of the things we've recognized, or at F5 more broadly, no, I don't want to take credit. We're not the only ones that had this insight, right? But when you look at the history of Node.js, JavaScript, the most commonly used programming language in the world,
mhm.
started in the browser. And you had Ryan Dahl sit and look at that and say, it'd be really cool if I could take that out of the browser and put it on the server. And then WebAssembly, part of the JavaScript engines in every major web browser.
Yep.
And then you have folks predominantly organized in the Bytecode Alliance, which is kind of a cross-vendor, cross-industry organization. NGINX has a voting seat there, saying the same thing. Well, what if we took the WebAssembly runtime out of the JavaScript runtime and put that on the server all on its own? And you're starting to get these explorations of what it might look like to run WebAssembly standalone outside of anything to do with the web as a context. And again, to your point, you have to know to target it. You have to have a runtime, or you have to do that final ahead of time step somewhere to go from the abstract machine code of WebAssembly into an actual architecture. But it's there and it works and it's everywhere today. So there's evangelism to be done, but I think the technology is a lot more baked and a lot more pervasive than people realize.
Yeah, and I will tell you that I decided it was baked, even though it wasn't necessarily server side purely, was when I saw Photoshop running in WebAssembly on my browser at 93% updated performance. And
Yeah.
that to me was like shocking because that is one really old code base with a lot of hairy code in it. So the fact that they could do that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's all compilers and machine targets and what can you abstract, and the web is a platform. The web itself, the APIs it provides are really, really powerful, and you can so this is the ex-Mozillian in me. Like you can you can view the web as a target. And what we were trying to do when we created WebAssembly was get rid of Flash. The web used to have all of these third-party proprietary plugins that
Mhm.
you load content and you try to open a PDF, and now all the browsers have built-in PDF renderers and they're all safe and secure now. But it used to be it would then go and boot up, usually Adobe Acrobat or some other PDF reader, pass the raw bytes from the internet to that, and then run it inside kind of almost like an iframe inside your browser. And that was a huge route for browser crashes, for security
Yeah.
sandbox escapes. We wanted to get rid of Flash because that wasn't standardized. And if you do that,
Yeah.
how do you, to your point, running Photoshop on the web, you have these code bases that companies have spent 20, 30 years on that are in C or C++. How do game engines, how do you bring those to the web? Because you can't just rewrite into JavaScript. You can't, I mean, JavaScript's a high level language. It has garbage collection. It has ideas about what the shape and use of memory is. You need something lower level. You need something more performant. Hence WebAssembly. And that let you do that. Let you take all those classic applications, cross compile them to the web, and then they can just run and they can render to an HTML5 canvas and you're off to the races.
Okay. Yeah, so let's flip this back a little bit. So we've already talked kind of bit, and there's a lot of activity going on in the open source world. NGINX itself started with open source. 2002, Igor had the brilliant idea that he was going to solve a problem in Apache. 2004, it came out, and since then, we've had this NGINX open source um, project. Everybody's kind of familiar with that. That's the big, giant, massive open source gorilla for NGINX and F5. But we have a lot of projects, and at last count, I think there are 96 public repos on the NGINX accounts. What project do you think people should go look at?
I mean, I gotta say unit because I'm in part responsible for it. But I'm also I haven't dug into the code, but I think it would be interesting to go look at NJS. When we were looking at adding like a base level of scriptability for NGINX, for reasons that I don't know, I haven't been here long enough, we decided to build our own JavaScript runtime. And so there is a repo, an open source repo for NJS that is it's not fully ECMAScript 5 compatible, but like it's optimized for you've got an NGINX configuration and you want just a tiny little bit of scripting right there. And so how do you hit that optimal point between just enough programmability without having to boot up an entire JS VM and implement the whole thing and whatever, and still maintain the performance and the memory footprint and the efficiency that NGINX is known for. So
Mhm.
I think that's interesting, but I think one thing that we don't get as much credit or as much visibility on are Kubernetes projects. So we've got the NGINX Ingress controller, we have the NGINX Gateway Fabric. We have these ways to take this technology that was born out of a world before containers, before Kubernetes, and use all of the efficiency, all of the configurability, all of the power of NGINX in these modern cloud native contexts. I think that's important. And I think what NGINX Unit is trying to do as an application runtime, and by the way, all the stuff I'm talking about, open source, it's all open source here. Unit is an app runtime. So it can run Python, it can run Perl, it can run Ruby, it can run Java code.
WebAssembly.
Yeah, we're gonna get there. And it can run WASM. Um, and it can go inside your container. Like it used to be like, all right, you put Nginx in your container to serve your static files, but you're going to have another runtime
Mhm.
serving your actual application logic. Well, maybe you don't need that quite so much with these newer languages, Rust, Go, that can be exposed more directly to the web. You don't need the separate runtime, but WebAssembly, it's never going to be self-hosting, right? It's a virtual machine. You're not going to have the ability to natively execute WebAssembly. So you're going to need some sort of application server. Unit kind of fills that niche. So it goes in the container with your application code, can run that. There's some interesting stuff there. All of these projects, I think, are really fascinating, and they represent this motion towards taking. I mean, NGINX just celebrated its 20th anniversary. This
Yep.
20-year-old code base. There are working professional developers younger than NGINX. How do we bring that into the current context, and how do we do that from within? Just to be honest, like F5 is a large like, multinational corporation. We're an enterprise, and our business sells to other enterprises. And so finding a way to use the open source technologies that we have, the infrastructure capabilities we have with NGINX to address the on the ground needs of other practitioners is, I think, I just think it's really cool that we are still committed to the open source projects. We are still pushing in that direction. We are still taking the good parts of this old C code base that's been, it's not crufty, it's refined, it's been polished, it's really, really good code that happens to have a lineage. How do we take the good parts of that and put it into the future? And that's what we're seeing.
That actually brings up an interesting point that I tend to like to get people like yourself who's been deep into open source. Open source has had some interesting times recently between seeing relicensing from some single vendor walled garden approaches, abandoned projects. We've got even more security concerns keep coming up. But how can companies actually help to constrain and solve some of these problems?
So I think the hard thing is there have been a lot of struggles in the open source software community lately, and a lot of that comes down to these projects that are foundational for so many businesses, so many communities, so many projects, so many enterprises being sustained out of really just the benevolence of a corporate sponsor or a couple of load-bearing individuals.
Mhm.
And when the reality hits that people need to eat, that they need sustainable employment, that being a public face in the open source community on the internet is a very emotionally draining thing.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and you go try to say, "Well, all right, I'd like just a little bit of compensation so that I can keep going on." Or worse, and you see this with Elastic, where you have a company building really capable infrastructure products, and then you have a very, very, very large corporation come and sell a hosted version of that. Well, what do? You created all the value, but you're capturing none of the revenue. You're capturing none of the oxygen that actually sustains the project. And I don't know what the answer is. There were attempts earlier on with things like the Affero GPL to say, hey, anything that you open source, even if it's a network service, has to be open sourced. Your modifications, everything. But
It doesn't solve the service problem. It does
yeah,
not solve the services problem.
it doesn't. And I think there's a cultural problem in the free software movement and the open source movement where open source has become a corporate norm. Unless there is a reason to keep something proprietary, it feels like the default is that things go open source or at least open core. I remember seeing just pitched battles on mailing lists and news groups back in the day about MIT kind of permissive style open
Yep.
source licenses versus copyleft licenses. And developers, those of us on the ground building these things, building these systems, saying in mass, like, I don't want to deal with that. I want something simple. The BSD license, it's a couple of sentences. I can understand that. That's fine. But that left the software open to to use a loaded term, exploitation by larger actors, right? And so you have to balance. If you're going to open something up in the service of getting broader adoption, like NGINX is, what are you going to do to make sure that the people that are equipped to actually keep that going and perpetuate that value can still put food on the table and don't burn out and don't kind of unnecessarily create a single point of failure for the internet? I have no idea how you solve that. None. But it is this complex intertwining of economic, social, cultural issues all together, philosophical issues.
Yeah, that's actually a really good observation. This is not a simple problem, and this is not going to be solved immediately. Basically AGPL 3, which came out when AGPL was originally written, it was written in such a way that if you were being based on an international open standard, all of your code had to be open as well, which would have meant no large company would have played in that space. That just not going to happen. And then things like why we use Apache is that Apache helps protect against submarine patenting, so that people can't slide their patents magically into your code, because no developer is going to go search the patent library to see if this code happens to match up to something. So it became a really important thing. Changing gears just because, and this is one of my favorite questions to ask. And you can't say WebAssembly and you can't say any of these things here. What's your favorite non-work related open source project?
Can I say Firefox? Because that's former work related. I think you can have your differences with Mozilla Corporation's leadership and management and board of directors, but at a fundamental level, the open internet as a standards-based plurality of implementations, having someone at the table that is building a browser that's at the table not because they're an advocacy group, but because they actually have a stake in building the thing, that matters. Having a nonprofit there advocating for the users, not just the corporations and people. Mozilla takes money from Google and blah, blah, blah. Still, you look at the lineage of web browsers, you look at the importance of the web in our daily life and access to information in just connecting people and empowering people and educating people. And your options are Firefox or one of a million Chrome derivatives.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like that. I don't like that consolidation. And you could argue WebKit on the iOS side and the Apple side, but Chrome itself is a derivative of WebKit way back when, both of which are derivatives of KHTML from the KDE open source project. And so there's this lineage where you have the KHTML derived browsers and you've got Gecko, the Firefox engine, and that's kind of it. And if we want to preserve open standards-based access to information, if we want to preserve a web in the public interest, we need someone like Mozilla carrying that torch. And they're not perfect, but the Firefox project has a really, really special place in my heart. On a practical level, you can run uBlock Origin on Firefox for Android, so you actually get good ad blocking, and that's nice. But that was more of a rant.
That's fine. I've been known to go on a few rants myself around this, and WebKit is one of those. And you can get into the Flex Flash wars, which has its own history, and I'm not going to go into this. But any final thoughts you want to share with us?
One other plug on open source software, or an open source project outside of work. I'm a very intermittent contributor to the NGINX OS project. NGINX being a fully functional declarative package management system and build system tool that, much like the first time, if you're kind of old and you've used CVS or Subversion and then you touch Git for the first time, and you think like, oh wow, this software is awful, but it is so powerful. I can't go back. NGINX is that for me in terms of package management. It's completely replaced Homebrew. It's completely replaced. Like I don't use other Linux distros anymore. I don't use other package managers on my Mac. Like I use NGINX. It's declarative. If you can get over it, you unleash a bunch of Haskell programmers on an operating system is basically what happened. But you get over the syntax, you get over the complexity of the tooling, and the power it gives you to have reproducible builds and to truly capture all of the dependencies of your software. It's totally next level. There is a lot of interpersonal drama in that community right now, as it seems to be the fashion in open source today. But the core technical contributions being pioneered there are something else.
Cool. And since you mentioned CVS, let me do my quick shout out. Hi, Brian Berliner, who created CVS way back in the dark ages for this.
One shout out, Carl Fogel wrote a book, Producing OSS, that's all about the development of Subversion, which was from the name, like meant to subvert CVS's dominance in some ways and kind of provide a more open, slightly more capable, more ergonomic alternative, and really kind of was that stepping stone towards modern distributed version control. And Carl wrote this amazing book talking about everything from the technical side, who gets to commit, how do you do code review, how do you work in the open, and it's all online, Producing OSS. Go read it.
Cool. Dan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. We really appreciate you coming on. This has been fascinating. And with that, let me thank all of y'all for joining us today to hear what Dan's thoughts are and listen to a few rants from the two of us as well here. If you've got your own thoughts, feel free to leave them for us in the comments. We'll see you next time. And in the meantime, may the open source be with you.
Thank you so much.